The dolls never blinked. That was always the first thing Ren Kurosawa noticed when he unlocked his shop in the quiet haze of the morning. Dozens of glass eyes would catch the weak sunlight, but they never seemed to reflect it back correctly. It was as if they were looking straight through him, at something far behind him, something he couldn't see. The faded sign outside read, Kurosawa Antiques and Restoration. It was an old sign for an old building filled with even older things. Most potential customers would peer through the dusty front window, hesitate, and then walk away. Ren preferred it that way. The fewer interruptions, the better. He lived a solitary life, sleeping on a simple futon in a small room above the shop, tucked between towering shelves of unfinished dolls and spare parts. At night, the old building would settle around him with a chorus of soft pops and weary sighs, the aged wood contracting and groaning like old bones. Some nights, he'd wake with a start, absolutely convinced that someone had whispered his name. But when he held his breath and listened, straining his ears in the deep silence, all he could ever hear was the faint, delicate knock of porcelain touching porcelain. It was just the dolls, he'd tell himself. Just the dolls shifting in the dark. His work was his entire world. He repaired these miniature figures with the focus and precision of a surgeon. A hairline crack in a ceramic cheek would be sealed so perfectly it became invisible. Faded paint on a tiny dress would be meticulously reapplied, matching the original hue exactly. A broken limb would be replaced with a flawless new one. He could fix almost anything, except for the faces. The faces he never, ever altered. He'd mutter to himself while he worked, his voice a low whisper in the quiet shop. Faces remember, he once said, speaking to a small doll that was missing half its cheek. Even when people pretend they don't. After hours of intense focus, when the work for the day was finally done, Ren would wash his hands obsessively, scrubbing until the water ran ice cold and his skin burned from the friction. There were never any visible stains, no paint or glue left on his fingers, but he scrubbed it anyway. He knew some stains you couldn't see. Guilt has no color, after all. It only has weight. One dreary afternoon, the little bell above the door chimed, announcing a visitor. A young woman stepped inside, her presence immediately cutting through the shop's stagnant air. She had ash-blonde hair that seemed to absorb the dim light, and her eyes, though tired, held a sharp, unwavering confidence. Her voice was clear and didn't hesitate when she spoke. "You made these," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. Ren didn't even bother to look up from the delicate arm he was reattaching. "I repair them," he corrected her, his tone flat and dismissive, but she wasn't deterred. She began to walk slowly through the cluttered aisles, her fingers hovering just above the dolls, close enough to feel their cold presence but never actually touching them. Funny, she mused, her voice soft but carrying a strange weight. They all feel unfinished. At her words, Ren's steady hand slipped. A sickening crack echoed in the silence as the porcelain arm he was holding split in two. She turned her head slowly, her gaze finally locking onto him. "I'm Aya," she said. He didn't offer his name in return. He didn't want her here. But Aya came back the next day, and the day after that. She never bought anything. She never even pretended to be a customer. She would just stand there, a silent observer, watching him work for hours on end. Sometimes she would ask him careful, pointed questions about his techniques, about the history of certain dolls. And sometimes she would say things that were deeply unsettling, things that seemed designed to crawl under his skin. "Do you ever feel like you're building replacements?" She asked him once, her head tilted slightly. For who? Ren had snapped back, his patience wearing thin. Aya's gaze was piercing. "For the people who didn't survive you." Ren didn't get any sleep that night. Her words echoed in the darkness, twisting around the soft whispers of the house, and then the dreams returned. They were old, familiar nightmares he had long tried to suppress. He was back in the basement, a cold, damp space filled with dolls, but these weren't sitting on shelves. They were hanging from hooks on the ceiling, suspended by thick threads. And the threads weren't embedded in fabric and porcelain, but in skin. He could hear a girl crying softly in the corner, her voice trembling as she apologized over and over for moving when she wasn't supposed to. Ren would wake up with a jolt, his hands clenched into tight fists, his knuckles white, as if he were still gripping those invisible strings. The memories started to flood back, unstoppable now. He remembered the old house, the one his parents would lock him and his sister inside whenever they left for days at a time. He remembered the suffocating loneliness, how it slowly curdled into a dark and twisted obsession. He remembered how he first learned to make dolls. He made them because they were perfect companions. Dolls always stayed. They never left. Unlike people. Unlike his sister, Mika. During his waking hours, strange things started happening in the shop. Things he couldn't explain. Dolls he had left on his workbench would appear on a shelf across the room. A doll with a significant crack he hadn't gotten to yet would suddenly be fully restored with no memory of him ever fixing it. And the scariest part? Sometimes he would catch his own reflection in the glass of a display case, but it wasn't quite right. The reflection would be standing just behind him, a faint knowing smile playing on its lips. And then the reflection would blink. Ren himself would not. The day finally came when Aya spoke the words Ren had spent 12 years burying. They were standing in the middle of the shop, surrounded by the silent, watchful eyes of the dolls. Mika Kurosawa disappeared 12 years ago, she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a razor. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with unspoken history. She was officially declared a runaway, Aya continued, her gaze never leaving his face. But her belongings were found in the basement of your old house. There was blood on the floor, and scratch marks on the walls. Ren's voice, when it finally came, was a hollow, empty sound. Why are you here? He asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. She met his eyes, and for the first time he saw a flicker of profound sadness in them. Because I was her friend, she said simply. As if on cue, the dolls all around them seemed to shift, letting out a chorus of soft creaks, like old joints adjusting to a new position. You loved her, Aya said, her voice softening, but you didn't see her as a person. You saw her as something beautiful you could preserve. Something you could keep forever, and just like that, the final wall in his mind crumbled. He remembered that night with perfect, horrifying clarity. He saw Mecca, desperate, struggling against the locked basement door. He heard her crying, begging him to let her out, promising she wouldn't leave. She would never leave him if he just unlocked the door. And he remembered his own decision. It wasn't anger that made him keep it locked. It wasn't panic. It was a cold, deliberate choice. In a fit of pure terror and desperation, Ren tried to destroy the dolls. He grabbed the nearest one and smashed it against the floor, but the porcelain didn't even chip. He grabbed a heavy hammer from his toolbox and swung it with all his might, but it just bounced off the doll's placid face. He tried to set them on fire, but the wood and fabric only absorbed the flames, refusing to burn. And through it all, their glass eyes followed him with a serene, unnerving calmness. Aya watched him from the doorway, her expression one of pity. You still don't understand, do you? She said. What? Ren screamed, his voice raw with fear. What don't I understand? The curse isn't the dolls, she replied, her voice echoing in the suddenly vast space. It's you. The shop around him began to darken. The walls seemed to peel back like old sun-baked paint, revealing not the street outside, but the basement from his nightmares, superimposed over everything, and Mika was standing there. She wasn't a ghost, but she wasn't alive either. She was something in between, assembled from fragments of his memory and pieces of cold porcelain. You wanted me to stay forever, she said, her voice impossibly gentle. So now you will. Threads, thick and strong, erupted from his hands, his feet, his spine pulling him, anchoring him, reshaping him. His body went rigid, his joints locking into place one by one. His skin grew smooth and hard. Aya's final words were a whisper on the wind. This is where choice ends. Months later, the shop reopened. A new doll sat in the center display window. It was life-sized, exquisitely crafted, and immaculate in every detail. Its eerily lifelike eyes seemed to follow customers as they passed by on the street. Aya ran the shop now. She was a diligent owner, dusting the shelves carefully each morning, but she never, ever stayed after sunset. Sometimes late at night, when the streetlights outside would flicker, the life-sized doll's lips would tremble. It wasn't enough to form a scream, not enough to whisper a confession. It was just enough to remember. And all the other dolls in the shop never blinked, their glass eyes fixed on the new addition, because now, finally, they were not alone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more.